A half century ago, some students came into my office wanting to know if I would represent them if they were to burn their draft cards on the courthouse lawn. I said, sure. Uh, but I really thought that, and told them so, that other than making money for me, I didn't see much point in their uh, endeavor or what they were attempting to do, because that wasn't really the problem. And you could make a few headlines locally about burning your draft card, and you could feel part of the student group that burned their draft cards, and you could feel somewhat martyred because you burned your draft card. And that was about it. I spent a lot of time with the students inquiring what their motive was. Why did they want to burn their draft cards? Well, they were against the war in Vietnam. Why are you against the war in Vietnam? And the students ran the spectrum there from pacifism to various other reasons. And after a lot of discussion, it got boiled down to the assumption that Congress wasn't doing its job. Congress wasn't investigating the facts behind the Vietnam War. It was delegating policy to the executive branch, and the Constitution said Congress should declare war and not ignore this or delegate to a different branch of government or delegate to a committee or to a dictator or whatever. So after a few meetings, they formed a committee and drafted a constitutional amendment to the state constitution, providing that no citizen of the state of Colorado could be drafted to serve in an undeclared war. We researched it pretty thoroughly with the Posse Comitatus Act and a few other little nuances in law. And the petition or the amendment was based on separation of powers. And Congress was specifically given the power to declare war by Congress. And under separation of power, the president was commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but as commander-in-chief, he couldn't play with the armed forces weren't his own personal toy. There were certain limitations and certain things that had to be done for him to play with his toy soldiers. And one of which was that the executive branch had the armed forces in it, but as the head of the CEO or the head of the executive branch, he had to follow various constitutional restraints, both that of Congress and of the Supreme Court and the court system. And this wasn't being done. It hadn't been done for a long time. We got in these so-called police actions through various treaties or whatever. And what the government started doing was drafting people because the government could, and nobody really objected. And in the 60s, people started objecting. They objected to the war. They objected to the whole procedure, to conscientious objectors, and legality of the war, illegality of the war, legality of the draft, etc. There was litigation going on with conscientious objectors, draft dodgers, etc. Many of these cases I did out of my office. And because I believed in a lot of what I was doing, I never charged anyone for doing this, which unfortunately affected my future as far as retirement is concerned. But be that as it may, what I researched and what the student group researched is, first off, the state of Colorado was admitted after 2 failures to the Union of the United States of America upon submitting its state constitution to Congress for approval and ratification. That constitution provided for amendment of the Constitution and also for referendum, political referendum, meaning you could put things on a ballot that the public could vote on, recall, and other such remedies of the citizens. The state constitution says the power of government is in the citizens. It also said that the militia of Colorado consists of everyone over the age of 18. Every male citizen over the age of 18 shall comprise the militia. And a lot of the government claimed that when they militarized and formed the National Guard, that this took precedent over the state definitions. I would quarrel with that, but that was one of the things that ought to be tested. So my theory was that until Congress declared war, that the sovereign ability to designate and define various definitions of citizenry and citizen obligation, etc., belonged to the states. And Congress could have a selective service, they could have a draft, as long as they declared war, giving them jurisdiction and power to do so. But the executive branch couldn't just unilaterally say, hey, we want to send you over there to have people take pot shots at you and get killed. There were a lot of things going on back then. There was a champion boxer named Cassius Clay who changed his name to Muhammad Ali that refused to be inducted into the United States. It cost him his world championship boxing title and a few other things. There were several people that objected to the war as such on a policy basis, on an intellectual basis or whatever, one of which was a think tank by the government called RAND Corporation, who had a few scientists there that disagreed with the foreign policy. And what it boiled down to is how do we formulate policy in a democratic society and maintain a democratic society? Or did we give up our democratic society and let a bunch of self-appointed guardians, saviors, whatever, tell us who our enemies are or should be and dictate policy? So it wasn't that I was for or against the war. It was because I was for the Constitution. And I was against circumventing the Constitution. I was against circumventing the rule of law. And I viewed myself as a patriot for that reason. Now, coincidentally, my younger brother also viewed himself as a patriot, and he was a career Air Force officer and did a lot of clandestine things. He won 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and both of them saw our duty to the country in 2 different ways, but the end result was the same, and we agreed on many things. Philosophically, if not on a practical matter, such as war and the draft, etc. But he always stood up for my right to free speech and said so to some of his commanding officers at the time when they threatened him because of some of my antics. It was a real curious time. And I had a lot of clients that were Vietnam vets. And they felt the same way I did. In fact, some of them felt even worse. Some of them felt betrayed. Many of them were to the point where they would throw grenades into their officers' tents in an operation called fragging that people talked about but would never admit publicly. There was a lot of protest that didn't make the news, and a lot of dissent that didn't make the news. And a lot of the protests did make the news, like the Chicago Convention of 1968, but the press pretended not to understand what the whole thing was about. But what it was about really is governmental power. Do we institute the power in the executive through something like the Bay of Tonkin resolution, or do we actually discuss and have participatory democracy and determine whether we should go to war and subject our citizens to exposure to death for the benefit of corporations or the benefit of a privileged few or for the benefit of the country as a whole? And that never really got fully discussed because there were too many vested interests that didn't give a shit about the citizenry. They didn't give a shit about the people. All they cared about was profits, power, things like this. Even to the point of whacking a president, I believe. So, as the 50-year mark comes up on policy, and we see where we've had an attempted coup d'etat, we can see what happened as a result of not reining in the power of the executive branch 50 years ago or a half century ago. And we should be wary of this. We should look at the motivation of the people. We shouldn't be flag waving, and anybody that says, let's go kill a commie for Christ, should be deemed a patriot, and anybody that says, hold on, it should be deemed a traitor. That's ridiculous. That's that's playing into the hands of a lot of anti-democratic forces that are not good for the people of this country. People that care only for themselves or their own pockets rather than for the people of the country. And I think the government it's about time the government started acting for the benefit of the people and not the corporations, for the benefit of the citizens, and start examining some of the policies and making sure the policy serves the people and not certain vested interests. We shouldn't be allowed to have propagandists mold our thinking in such a way that it promotes business interests over that of the individual, over that of the citizen, over that of the person. We exist. Corporations don't exist. Corporations were created. They were a figment of state legislators. We created them. We can abolish them. They have no right to perpetual existence any more than I have. I expect to die soon because I'm old. I'm not as old as General Motors, or I'm not as old as Standard Oil or some of those, and they expect to live forever. I don't know that that's really right or not. We should think about this. And that's about enough for the day. I hope you people think about things, and please give me your feedback. Next, we're going to go into the marketing of heroin by the government to various people, including its own citizens, for the sake of profit.